Hello and welcome back to the Commander Lurpack YouTube channel. In today's video I'll be showing you how I built the next section of my Warhammer 40k gaming table. Hope you enjoyed the video and thanks for watching. Unlike with the previous board sections where I just went for it, I decided to actually plan out and design the board section after having some problems with the scale of the last board section.
This is the one!
As much as I enjoy jigsawing my boards in half, I decided that having a rough plan might help prevent this. I decided to design a more open board section, not as dense as the previous sections. This would allow for more ease of manoeuvring vehicles when playing the tabletop game, and also to draw line of sight over greater distances that aren't obscured by the large hab blocks. I wanted to still balance this openness with detail on the board, so opted for craters and some dead trees as the main focus on the board. I had the idea of putting a hill in the centre of the board, but later on in the board building process I realised that this would start to crowd the board and do the opposite of what I wanted, which was to create space. Happy with my rough plan, I transferred it onto the 2 by 2 foot MDF board section. I'm using a 12mm thick sheet as the thickness gives the board some stability and avoids warping over time. I then started work on the small ruined building in the corner of the board. I used a sheet of foam board to make the walls of the building. The foam board is a really nice material to work with, being soft enough to cut easily with a craft knife, but strong enough to maintain shape. I used the craft knife to carve cracks and bullet holes in the wall sections so they did not appear too flat and textureless. I covered this in detail in the previous board build where I did a 6-story hab block at the cost of my sanity. If you're interested, check it out. For the dead trees, nature is your friend. I scoured my garden for dead twigs and roots that looked the part of miniature trees, probably to the confusion of my neighbours. It is important, however, to dry out any moisture from these twigs and roots before use. When selecting trees or materials that we need to fit in with the scale, I find it useful to place a model next to it for a visual reminder, and you can immediately tell if it looks out of place. Happy with my trees and that I had enough of them.
Give him a little friend. Everybody needs a friend.
I stuck everything down with tacky glue, which you can buy from most craft shops. Next up, it was time to make the craters for the board. The material I used was XPS foam. As I work as a handyman, I handily managed to get a few offcuts of insulation board for crafting. The foam is very easy to work with and can be sculpted with a hobby knife. Once primed up with Mod Podge, it goes very hard and is quite durable with no weight to it, which is ideal for gaming terrain. Once happy with the crater, I stuck it along with some smaller ones to the board with tacky glue. I then started work on the barbed wire section of the board. I wanted to give the impression of some hastily dug defences in the mud. I used pre-made barbed wire from the internet, as let's be honest, things take long enough as it is without making your own barbed wire from scratch. I then snapped cocktail sticks in half to resemble stakes to secure the wire in the foam earth. I secured it all in place with super glue. I later added a few sandbags to the barbed wire line. A gaming table set in the 40k universe without guardsmen corpses is not complete in my mind. After remedying this, I painted the board a dark brown. Before this step, of course, I coated all the soluble materials with the Holy Mod Podge. One of my favourite steps, the mud for the mud god step. I used Vallejo thick European mud to create the mud effects on the board. I have used this product on all the previous board sections, and is the basing scheme for all of my armies. I think it has a great colour and texture that lends a contrast to the often colourful 40k army schemes, very reminiscent of war zones such as Stalingrad. I applied the mud using a stippling effect to create further texture with little mounds and craters. To create tank tracks going through the mud, I quite simply dragged the Lehman Russ through the mud. What better way to create tank tracks than with a tank?
And modern problems require modern solutions.
After covering the board with the Vallejo thick European mud, I applied a darker mud from Citadel called Stirland Battlemire. I used this in areas of the board I wanted to create contrast and depth, such as the craters and also the tank tracks. Now it was time to add some grass to the board. I used self-adhesive grass tufts from Warhammer Scenics. The little bit of colour helps break up the brown board. I would have added more grass tufts to the board, but used all my supplies up on this section. I went back and added some rubble and debris to the ruined building in the corner of the board. I did this both internally and externally. This helps sell the idea it was once a complete building and it has been destroyed, the rubble of the building now littering the ground around it. You thought the mud step was over? Well, some say the mud step is never over. It's time to add AK Puddles to the board. This is a resin-based product that creates a wet and muddy effect to the Vallejo thick European mud. As it is a self-leveling material, it sits in all the texture on the board, creating little puddles. This is why it was important to use the stippling method earlier. I applied this AK interactive puddles to the entire board. With the mud step complete, I added some propaganda posters to the board. I printed out Warhammer TV Peachy's PDF and cut them out. I find screwing up the posters before gluing with Mod Podge gives them a realistic look. So I decided there wasn't enough corpses on the board. However, I now had to paint 13.5 guardsmen. I barely find time to paint my intact guardsmen, let alone casualties, so decided on a simplistic method. I painted them all a dark grey before stippling on Vallejo thick mud to blend them in with the environment. This helped to disguise the lack of effort in the paint scheme. I then added one of my favourite paints to the board, Blood for the Blood God. This splash of vivid wet red contrasted the dull brown of the mud and provided a needed splash of colour on the board. I do often feel sorry for my spare guardsmen, but it doesn't last long. To finish the craters, I used AK Puddles again, but much thicker than before, to create a deep murky water effect in the crater. I did this while the Blood for the Blood God paint was still wet, so some of the paint would leach off into the puddle mixture to create a cool effect. One problem with the resin is air bubbles, but this is a problem with any resin. Unless you have the patience of a saint, it is impossible to get rid of them all, but I popped most of the noticeable ones with a lighter. At some point I did paint the ruined building, however forgot to record it. To finish off the board, I painted the rim of the MDF black, so that it would frame the board nicely. The board took just over a day to finish, and it was just in time for Armies on parade. I'm very happy with the outcome, and I'll sod off now and give you the final reveal.